Are you in Mark chapter 7? Let me read an article that I read earlier, and I think this article is a bit of a summary of what so many people in our world believe, and I just want to share this with you before we jump into our message tonight. It's titled, Trust Your Heart. Trust Your Heart. I'm not going to read the entire article. It's written by somebody that I generally wouldn't agree with at all, but I want you to see what many people in our culture do believe, what they're been listening to, and what they're doing. What are people in our culture? What are people in our country? What are people like us? What are they basing their decisions on? How are they deciding what they're going to do? Is it, and we mentioned this in Sunday school just a little bit, is it based on foundations of truth? Is it based on the Word of God? Is it based on how they were raised? Is it based on what their parents did? Is it based on where they went to school? Is it based on what's legal, what's illegal? In this case, the author says, just trust your heart. Let me read a little bit of what this author said. This particular person is a transformational coach and a counselor. So this is the kind of person that is going to be telling people this and teaching people this. And just I want you to get a little bit of the philosophy that I'm going to be preaching in exact opposite of tonight, okay? Your heart speaks the truth. It's as simple and as sacred as this. No one knows your heart better than you do. Your heart speaks to you every day in the language of love. That sounds great. Sounds good. It speaks to you with kindness and hope. It never speaks of fear and doubt, and it will never betray you. Your heart honors you. And when you listen to the guidance of your heart, your peace and happiness is restored. Your heart wants only the best for you. It's up to you to trust your beautiful heart because it ultimately means that you're trusting yourself. By trusting your heart, you are validating your inner voice, affirming that you have the answer to what is best for you. Treasure your heart and treasure yourself. Know that you hold the key to your happiness and joy. No one can give it or take it away from you. It's been with you all along. Now, I do agree with that part. And it resides in your heart. Let the magic of your heart guide you towards love, joy, and happiness. Your heart holds the key to your life. Your dreams, wishes, and desires are all embedded in your heart. Whom your heart chooses to love, your life's work, and your purpose all reside in your heart. Now that sounds really good. It sounds empowering. It sounds like if I could believe this, I could go out and conquer the world. I could do anything because I have the answers in my heart. I know what's right and wrong in my heart. I know what I'm supposed to be doing the rest of my life because it's in my heart. I know my calling. I know my purpose. I know my directions because it's in my heart. Unfortunately, in Jeremiah 17:9, God said, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Mark chapter 7, look at verse 14. We'll just read 3 verses and we'll use that as a starting point. Mark chapter 7, verse 14, and when he, that's Jesus, had called all the people unto him, he said unto them, hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. Then he gives this little statement, if any man have ears to hear, let him hear. The idea behind that last statement was this: if you care to try to understand, dig deeply and understand what it is I'm talking about. There's nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. So I brought some apples tonight, and I like apples. Sometimes I like apples more than other times I like apples. These are Gala apples. I really like Gala apples. There's some apples that I don't particularly care for. The really squishy ones, the ones that you bite into and it's like you're eating applesauce in a skin. Those aren't really my favorite kind of apples. But then there's some that are just really, they're too tart and crispy. I bought 3 apples, and Jonathan was with me, so we got an extra green one. He said, Dad, can I have that green apple? So he got a Granny Smith apple. Now, I used to be able to eat Granny Smith apples. I can't do it anymore. They hurt my teeth now. They're tart, and then you kind of like nails on a chalkboard in your mouth. That's kind of the best way I can describe it. I like apples. Now, the way I understand, well, let me back up just a little bit here. One of the worst things in the world to do is to pick an apple off the tree and bite into the apple, and there's half a worm in the apple. That's one of the, you spit it out. I'm not going to eat that worm that I ate out of that apple. But at the same time, I remember wondering this. How did that worm get in that apple? And if you look at, usually at the store they don't have them, with apples with holes in them where worms are in and stuff. But if you pick one off of somebody's tree, you pick an apple off a tree, and you look at it, and there's a hole in there, and you think, that's where the worm went in. That's not the apple that I'm going to eat. But that's really not the way it works. The way it works is this: the fly, or whatever it was, the moth or whatever, it lays an egg inside the blossom before the apple is formed. And that egg is inside, before this is an apple, it's a beautiful flower. And the egg is laid inside of that, and the apple grows around that egg. So it's not what goes into the apple that ruins it, it's what's already inside of the apple. And if you see a hole in your apple, it's because the worm has come out of the apple already. It's not what goes into the apple that ruins it. So I've been doing it all wrong. I've been looking for the one with the hole and saying, no, that's not the one I want. What I should have been looking for and saying, yeah, that's the escape route. I'm good with that one. It's not what goes into the apple that defiles it. It's what comes out of the apple. It's the worm that's in there before, and it coming out of the apple. I know there's a worm in this apple. This is a whole nother lesson, but there's a book, I think John Rice wrote it, All the Devil's Apples Have Worms. I'm not even going to go that direction this morning, or this evening. If you understand what Jesus is saying here, there's nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. It's not the things that we eat he's speaking of, but it's something else. A little bit of background. The Pharisees, in verse number 5, had accused the disciples of breaking the law when they didn't wash their hands before they ate. You're in Mark chapter 7. Look at verse number 5. And I want you to see this. The Pharisees they're all up in arms. They're upset about this. Mark chapter 7, verse 5. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, they're talking to Jesus, why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? They're not washing their hands. We preached about it last week. We gave you lots of signs of a Pharisee. And they accused the disciples of breaking the law. And then Jesus rebuked those Pharisees in verse number 6. He answered and said unto them, well hath Isaiah, that would be Isaiah, just a different way of saying it, well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. We're going to come back to that word, their heart is far from me. We're going to see how important that is. Verse number 7, howbeit, Jesus is still rebuking the Pharisees, howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things ye do. And he said unto them, full well, this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees, full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. Wow. I hate getting chewed out. I hate getting rebuked in public, and that's exactly what just happened to these Pharisees. And then right after that, Jesus uses the opportunity to teach a lesson. And that's what we just read, is in verse numbers 14 through 16. Basically, the lesson is this: you don't get defiled from the outside in, you get defiled from the inside out. The disciples were confused. They're talking about eating. They're talking about not washing their hands before they eat, and not washing cups and not washing bowls and all of that. So the disciples, they're confused. What the Pharisees said makes sense.
It really did. If they were to eat something dirty, the dirty would be inside of them. Wouldn't you agree with that? You eat mud, you got mud inside of you. I remember watching, I think it was my brother, I think it may have been when he was a baby down at the beach, and just watching him eat the sand. I don't know what it is with babies and eating sand. Maybe it feels good on their gums or something. I'm not sure. You ever get a grain of sand and something you're eating and it just sends those chills all through your body? If you eat sand, you're going to have sand inside of you. You eat something nasty, you're going to have nasty inside of you. So it made sense what the Pharisees were saying. You wash your hands before you eat. Jesus knew what germs were. The disciples at that time didn't. He didn't go into a long lecture of, because of germs, you wash your hands. We didn't understand a lot of that until just recently. But Jesus said, look, you don't get defiled from the outside in, you get defiled from the inside out. The Pharisees made sense. If they were to drink poison, the poison would make them sick. So the disciples are hearing the Pharisees talk, and then they're hearing Jesus say, no, you don't get defiled from the outside in, you get defiled from the inside out. And the disciples were thinking, our minds are spinning. What are you talking about? What Jesus said didn't make sense. Basically, so Lord, what you're saying is, it's not the things that I eat that defile me, it's the things that come out of me that defile me. And without going into any more detail, I think they might have been, Lord, I think you lost me somewhere there. I'm just not quite sure where you're going with this. And then in verse 17, Jesus explains. So look at Mark chapter 7, verse 17. And when he was entered into the house from the people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. You notice the disciples did it this way. They didn't generally do that in front of the crowd. But once they got back in private, they're like, Lord, what are you talking about? That didn't make a whole lot of sense. Verse 18, and he saith unto them, are ye so without understanding also? Do you not perceive, don't you get it? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? No matter what you eat, no matter what comes in, he's telling them, it can't defile you. So unwashed hands can't defile me. So eating nasty stuff can't defile me. And then we realize what Jesus is talking about. It's in verse, look at verse 19 now. It cannot defile him, verse 19, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats. Jesus wasn't talking about eating. He wasn't talking about washing your hands so that you don't eat something that's dirty. He was talking about something more important than that. The disciples thought he was talking about their bellies. Jesus was talking about their hearts. The worm, get the big one here. The worm doesn't defile the apple by going into the apple. The worm defiles the apple because it's in the apple already. And we see the worm as it comes out. There's a song about that, I think, but I'm not going to sing it for you tonight. And then Jesus makes the lesson practical in verse 20. It's not just a philosophical idea now. It's not just this, you sit in school and learn this thing. It wasn't just him teaching the disciples some theories. He wants to make this real for them. He wants to make this something that they can take from him and live on the way out. I love preaching that does that. Something that we hear it from the Bible, and it's not just something that we can say, wow, that was a great truth, but something that I can say, I can live that on the way home. I can do that this week. So he makes it practical in verse 20. And he said, that which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile the man. Jesus just laid it out there. He didn't keep it in abstracts. He said, okay, now that you understand the principle, here's the things that if they come out of your heart, these are what defile you. That he went through that. And some of these words are words that we don't use on an everyday basis. I thought just quickly define them for you. Adulteries would be simply unfaithfulness of a married person to their spouse. Fornication's very similar, but we're talking about an unmarried person now. Murders, unlawful killing of a human being. Thefts, secretly taking something that belongs to someone else. There's a difference between theft and robbery. Robbery would be taking it from someone with force. Theft is taking it secretly. Covetousness is wanting something that belongs to something else. Isn't that interesting that God put thefts and covetousness in the same category? Taking something that belongs to somebody else, or just wanting something that belongs to something else. Those things, he said, those come out of the heart and they defile a man. Then he says wickedness. That's simply departing from the rules of God's law. God has a lot to say about wickedness. Deceit. I think you understand that. That's lying. That's bearing false witness. The Bible even says, thou shalt not bear false witness. Deceit would be just clearly breaking one of the 10 Commandments, as some of these other ones are. Lasciviousness is one of those words that we don't use on a regular basis. The word lascivious means loose. Whenever we're talking about morality, we could use the word lustful. We could talk about immoral sins, and that would be lasciviousness. An evil eye. I had to look that one up. I've seen some people as I was preaching. I thought that's the evil eye right there. An evil eye means envy. It means greed. It means jealousy. And somebody said you've got the phrase a green eye of, is it green eye of envy, green eye of jealousy? Have you ever heard of that? Nobody has? I neither. All right, so we'll move right on. Blasphemy. This is reproachful, contemptuous, or irreverent words against God. Saying things about God that are not true. Bringing God down to the level of a man, or insulting God, or even bringing yourself up to the level of God. The Pharisees, the scribes, the priests, they arrested Jesus, they crucified Jesus for saying that He was God. They called it blasphemy. And then there's pride. Thinking of yourself higher than you ought to. What is it with all of these things? There's one more we'll get to in a moment. What is it with all of these sins that we're talking about? Jesus said those sins, whenever they come out of our heart, that is what defiles us. Eating with unwashed hands, that doesn't defile us. But what comes out of our heart, that defiles us. These things that we do, these things that we think, these things that we say, pride. You know, Satan allowed pride into his heart before he sinned. Isaiah 14:12, you've got this description of Lucifer falling from heaven. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. That pride, when it comes from our heart, the pride as we exhibit it in our lives, that's what defiles a man, not eating with hands that aren't washed. And then he says foolishness. Foolishness, simply the lack of wisdom and understanding. Now, that's quite a list. Adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. And Jesus says, those are the things that defile a man. When they come from your heart and they come out of your heart, that's what defiles you. Not what comes into your body physically, but what comes out of your heart. Now, we know those things are wrong. But I think the question would be, how do we keep them from coming out of our hearts? That seems to be what Jesus is saying. When those come out of your hearts, you are defiling yourself. That is sinful. These things coming out of our hearts. So my question then is, Lord, how do I keep those things from coming out of my heart? Well, if these things are coming out of our heart, defiling, if the things coming out of my heart defile me, then I don't want to let it into my heart to begin with. We must guard our hearts so they don't have a place to grow. My challenge to you tonight, and this is where the rest of the message is going to go, is to guard the gates to your heart. There's certain gates that maybe you could call them senses if you want to. These gates to your heart. if it's true that what I eat and the things that come into my body through my mouth, as they were talking about, and into my belly, if those don't defile me, but the things that come out of my heart do defile me, I want to be careful not to let things into my heart that will come out of my heart. Let me try to describe that. Let me try to help you to understand what I'm trying to say with that. You've got some gates to your heart. One of the gates to your heart would be your eyes. You call it the eye gate. Things that you see. One of the gates to your heart would be the ear gate. The things that you listen to. Anything that you see will be imprinted upon your heart. The things that you listen to get cataloged in your heart. You've heard this statement. 5 years from now, you'll be the same person you are today except for the books you read and the people you meet. Maybe you've heard a statement like that. The idea behind that is the influences that you allow into your mind are going to be those things that change who you are. They come into your heart. The eye gate, the ear gate. You remember the story of the Trojan horse? Okay, so if you haven't heard this story, let me just help you to remember what it is. I won't go into all the details. Two armies are battling with each other. One's inside the wall, one's outside the wall. The one on the outside of the wall can't defeat the one on the inside of the wall, so they bring a big gift. It's a big wooden horse. And they leave it outside of the gate, and the army on the inside of the gate looks out and they say, well, look, the enemy's gone. But they left us a gift. Let's bring it inside. We know that's dumb now because we read the story. All right? So they open the gates, they bring it inside, they close the gates. Wow, I don't know what they were going to do with a big wooden horse. What would you do with a big wooden horse? I don't know, but it's a great gift. So it's inside of the castle walls now. The enemy was hiding inside of the wooden horse. They get out of the wooden horse, they go through and they attack and they defeat the city that's inside of the wall. We need to guard our gates, guard our eye gates, guard our ear gates. So just think about that Trojan horse for a moment. It was dangerous. It was deceptive. It was considered a gift. It was voluntarily brought into the gate. The army that lost wouldn't have lost except they voluntarily opened the gate and brought the Trojan horse into the gate. And because they voluntarily opened that gate, they lost the battle. Why are we... Let me back up here. I think I started with the wrong question. What are we? There we go. What are we choosing to put in our hearts? We're like the city with the gate. Stuff can't get put into our hearts without us opening the door, without us letting it in. So what are we voluntarily putting in our hearts? These things that Jesus mentioned here, evil, where were we here? Evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders. All of these things, this big list, all of these things, we don't want them coming out of our hearts, but let me warn you this evening about letting them to come into our hearts. What are we putting into our hearts? You know, stories put emotional thoughts into our hearts. I'll just use the word stories, but they're good stories, but there are also stories that you shouldn't allow into your heart. Whether you're reading the story or watching the story on a movie screen or on TV screen or reading the book or reading the novel, there's just some things we shouldn't allow into our hearts. Because if it's one of the things that Jesus is listing here, once we put it into our hearts and it comes out of our hearts, it defiles us. These stories, do they promote anything on the list that Jesus gave here? As I read this story or book or as I watch it or however I'm putting this story into my mind, is it a story of evil thoughts or adulteries or fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness? Are the stories about, do they glorify these things? Now, there are stories in the Bible about some of these things, but the Bible's not glorifying it. It's showing it's wrong, it's sinful, it's wicked. Am I allowing these stories into my heart And because I'm allowing them to my heart, have you ever heard of a copycat crime? It's a crime where somebody hears about somebody else doing something that's wrong. So you hear about a vandal causing some kind of damage, and then somebody hears about it and they go do the same thing somewhere else. It's called a copycat crime. They hear the story, they hear somebody else doing it, and they decide to do it themselves. You know, that's a really great way to understand what happens whenever we allow some things into our heart through stories, for example. We can hear about somebody doing something, read about somebody doing something, and then if it's something that is wrong to do, it's in our heart, and when it comes out of our heart, then it defiles us. We have the potential to do those things that we hear about, that we see and we learn through. I'm just using the word stories right now, so be careful what stories you allow into your heart. What are we choosing to put into our hearts? Music. Music is a language that bypasses the mind and speaks directly to the heart. And I want to challenge you to be aware and be vigilant, right, about what you put into your heart in the area of music. So if the music I'm listening to, if it promotes evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, we understand that that's loose living, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. If the music I'm putting into my heart is promoting any of those things, I'm putting those things into my heart, and those things will come out of my heart. That is going to defile me. I better be careful what I listen to. Listen, you better be careful what you listen to. And I can go through and I can name genre after genre. Are you impressed that I know how to say that G in genre? I couldn't even say. I remember one time preaching, and I mentioned Kanye West, and I preached about how awful Kanye West's music was, and people started laughing. I couldn't even pronounce that right. But, okay, so there's all kinds of different, it's Kanye, okay, just Kanye. So there's some genres of music, there's some types of music a Christian just shouldn't listen to. There's some things that, because now it may not be a hard rock beat, and this isn't a message about music, just kind of a taste, but it may not be a music that is a really hard rock beat, or it may not be heavy metal, right? Those of you that grew up in the 80s like I did. It may not be one of those things, but it may be music that's nice music, peaceful music. Music that we would say, well, that's not bad music, but is it promoting any of these things? Is it talking about adulteries, fornication? You know, most of popular music is about that. Adulteries, fornications, lasciviousness. Most of it. I mean, I've seen it, I've studied it a bit, and I realize that so much of what we listen to in our culture is about those types of relationships. And we better be careful what we're putting into our heart, because what comes out of our heart defiles us, and if we put it into our heart, out of the abundance of the heart, you ready? The mouth speaketh. If I put it in, it's going to come out somewhere. And like the worm coming out of the apple, we realize, that's a defiled apple. It's got a worm in it. Stories, music, pictures, and videos put thoughts into our hearts. Jesus made it practical. I figured I might as well too. Pictures and videos. Stories will put these things into our hearts. Music will put these things into our hearts. You've heard this statement, a picture is worth 1,000 words. The images that we see are so powerful. We must be very careful what we put into our hearts. The images that we see, be careful what images you allow into your heart. Paul Harvey wrote an article 50 years ago. The title of his article was called, If I Were the Devil. Some of you are familiar with it, some of you have heard it before. He updated it in 1996. This is the 1996 version of it. But he says this, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness. I'd have 1/3 of its real estate and 4/5 of its population, but I would not be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree. So I would set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. This was written in 1965 or 64. So I'd subvert churches first, And I would begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve, do as you please. To the young, I'd whisper that the Bible's a myth. I'd convince the children that man created God instead of the other way around. I'd confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square. And the old, I would teach to pray after me, Our Father which art in Washington. Then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors on how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellect but neglect to discipline emotions. I'd tell teachers to let those students run wild. And before you knew it, you'd have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing and judges promoting pornography. Soon I would evict God from the courthouse and the schoolhouse and then from the House of Congress. In His own churches, I'd substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I'd lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who want it until I'd killed the incentive of the ambitious. Well, do you bet I couldn't get whole states to promote gambling as the way to get rich? I'd convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, and that what you see on television is the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public and lure you into bed with diseases for which there are no cures. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing. Have you ever heard of Balaam? There's a man in the Old Testament named Balaam. He couldn't curse God's people for Abimelech, the king, and I can't tell you the whole story, but Balaam knew that if God's people brought sin into their homes, then God would be obligated to punish them. Abimelech came and said, Balaam, curse the people. And Abimelech said, okay, I'll ask God, God, can you curse these people for me? And God said, no, I'm not going to curse them, I'm going to bless them. Several times he went to several places and tried to curse God's chosen people as they were getting ready to come into the promised land. And each time God would say, no, Balaam, you cannot curse them, I'm not going to curse them, I'm going to bless them. But Balaam, the Bible says, taught God's people to sin. In fact, in Revelation, the Bible says it this way, I have a few things against thee, talking about one of the churches, because thou hast there them to hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols and to commit fornication. God wouldn't curse them. And the enemies of God couldn't get God to curse His people, but whenever they brought sin into their homes and sin into their lives, God was obligated to punish them. And in punishing them, they were cursed. So where does the solution start? Jesus said it very clearly. It's not what comes into you that defiles you. It's what comes out of your heart that defiles you. What do we do about that? So am I supposed to be careful what I say then? Well, yes. But it goes beyond that. It's something before that. So I need to be careful what I think then. Yes, but something before that. Being careful what I feel? Well, before that. It's being careful what you allow into your heart. If you allow things into your heart, those things will come out, and those defile you. What I allow into my heart will eventually lead me to sin. The Bible says, Proverbs 4:23, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. This is a real simple message this evening, but it's a challenging one because we live in a world where all around us there is a battle for your heart. The devil wants to get as much sin into your heart as he can. He wants to put as much into your heart as he can because he knows if he gets it in there, it's going to come out. And if it comes out, that defiles us. And then God's people are living these sinful lives, much like the Pharisees were living. We become ineffective. How are we supposed to witness to somebody at work whenever there's wickedness coming out of our hearts? Are we supposed to make a difference for God when there's wickedness? How am I supposed to be a father and a husband like God wants me to be whenever there's wickedness coming out of my heart? My challenge to you tonight is very simple. Guard your heart. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Father, thank you for letting us be able to spend some time together this evening. I feel that this was so important to Jesus that He pulled His disciples aside and He taught them. And He made, even in these verses, He made a list of these things we need to guard our hearts against. I feel it's important enough for us to be able to take the time tonight. Lord, I pray that You would help us to guard our hearts against wickedness. Pray that You would help us to guard our eye gate, guard our ear gates, guard our hearts from those things that, if we allow in, will defile us as they work their way out through our lives. Lord, I pray that You'd help Christians tonight to make some decisions for You. Maybe there's some things that we're watching that we shouldn't be watching. Maybe there's some music that we're listening to that we shouldn't be listening to because it's putting those things in our hearts, and those things are going to work their way out through our life. Lord, I believe that maybe there's some Christians here tonight that need to make a decision that they're going to guard their heart. They're not going to allow those things into their hearts, and they're going to live in a way that pleases You instead of just doing what we want to do. Lord, if there's anyone here tonight that's not saved, if they've not trusted You as their Savior, Lord, I pray that tonight would be the night that they trust You, the night that they get saved.